Every child in the United States has access to a free public education. That education is essential to improving people's lives. From better health outcomes to higher earnings. It's also essential to the economy and to creating a more informed, engaged citizenry.
We owe the children of America a good education.
No matter what you want to do with your life, I guarantee that you'll need an education to do it.
But many schools across the country are chronically underfunded, and some states have far more underfunded schools than others.
On March 1st, schools could lose more than $1 billion in funding.
Class sizes are just too large.
Scrambling to find qualified teachers for every classroom.
Funding for public schools comes primarily from two sources: state aid and the local property tax. For the past 100 years, a fierce debate has surrounded these two revenue sources and what constitutes a fair and effective education funding system. Some propose cutting the property tax and replacing it with state aid.
We cannot break the back of agriculture in this state with property taxes.
There are many areas of our state that have unsustainable school property tax rates.
Others call for increasing the property tax.
$81 million a year is what this property tax increase is expected to bring into the schools.
This is validation that our teachers are appreciated.
The Dallas ISD board, in fact, voted tonight to put a tax rate increase on the November ballot.
The onus is really on us. Are we willing to sacrifice a little to give our kids a lot?
So how can we improve school funding to ensure that all students receive a high-quality education? What should we do about underfunded schools in the United States? The first taxpayer-funded public schools in America were founded in colonial Massachusetts as early as the 1630s.
From the very beginning of this country, public education was a local government function. There was heavy reliance on local revenue to fund schools.
By the early 20th century, every state in the nation had established free and compulsory education for all students. These schools were mostly funded by local property taxes.
The property tax has a number of advantages. It gives you local control. Local funding leads to more funding because local funding means local support. If you're a homeowner in a community, then you have the opportunity to vote for higher property taxes for schools or not. You know that the value of your house depends on the quality of the schools. All of this makes you pay attention, makes you feel more involved, makes you be more involved. And then you do have that stability over the business cycle. When there's a recession, the property tax just keeps on ticking when state aid goes down. And so the property tax is more reliable, is more stable.
But funding schools with local taxes also has drawbacks, which came to light in the 1800s. The dramatic changes to the economy in the post-Civil War period created a vastly unequal distribution of wealth.
Over time, as the economy developed, I think the spatial inequalities grew, and it became increasingly evident that there were big differences in the amount of resources available for education and in the quality of education.
The major disadvantage of the property tax is the disparities from community to community. Some places have a high property base per pupil, some have a low property base per pupil. It is a problem of trying to pay for it locally. Any kind of local funding source leads to the disparities problem.
This problem with local funding was called out by education officials in the 1870s. The solution they proposed was for the state to step in and help. Eventually, an approach for state funding was developed which would guarantee a satisfactory minimum of per-student spending. This approach became known as foundation aid. Here's how a typical foundation formula works. First, the state establishes the minimum level of per-student spending. Then, they determine a recommended level of local spending, which assumes everyone charges the same property tax rate. Finally, state aid fills the gap. This system worked in theory, but many early adopters of foundation aid established minimum funding levels that were much lower than the cost of a decent education. Disparities among school districts persisted. In the 1960s, civil rights lawyers in Los Angeles filed a lawsuit arguing that California's system, which funded public schools primarily with local property taxes, discriminated against poor districts. At the time, the state had a foundation formula, but the minimum amount was only $355 for elementary school students.
And the basic injustice of taking one child in a poor district from a poor family and giving them a $300 public education, while another favorite child in a favored district gets a $1,000 public education is just such an obvious injustice.
The California Supreme Court declared the state's education funding system unconstitutional and ordered the state legislature to reduce spending disparities among school districts.
I am pleased and gratified to learn of the state Supreme Court's decision that the present system of financing public education in California is unconstitutional.
Around the same time, a movement was underway to reduce property taxes.
No single public issue has been of greater concern to our people than that of achieving real and lasting property tax relief.
An initiative known as Proposition 13 promised to slash property taxes.
Proposition 13 would cut property taxes about 60%. It could be the start of a national taxpayer revolt.
One of the characteristics of the property taxes is its great visibility. They're big payments. 2-4 times a year you have to write out a big check. And I think that's one of the things that leads people to be critical of it.
For 25 years, we've had increasing taxes on properties.
I think people are saying, hey, we're tired of this. We don't like paying these taxes.
And the day of bureaucratic control over California is gone. We don't want any more government by the bureaucrats, for the bureaucrats, and of the bureaucrats, at the pension of the bureaucrats.
George,
that day is coming to the end.
In 1978, California voters passed Proposition 13. Other states followed California's lead on both fronts, filing school funding lawsuits and seeking limitations on property taxes.
Tax revolt, a rallying cry of the middle class in the 1970s.
There's a whole history of school finance court cases and a parallel movement of tax limitations, which take very different forms in different states. And both of these elements, courts and property tax limitations, have important impacts on how we fund education in the U.S. today.
It was like the country was trying to have its cake and eat it too, pushing for more school funding while simultaneously cutting one of its major sources. So what was the outcome of all this? The school funding lawsuits and the legislative action they precipitated yielded some important progress. States were forced to raise the minimum standards for public education, providing much-needed increases in funding for property-poor districts across the U.S. And importantly, they also began to recognize that some students needed more money than others.
There's an immense amount of research that shows that students who are coming from low-income families require a lot more resources than a child who's coming from an upper-middle-class family. All those costs differ a lot across school districts, and one of the roles of a good state aid system is to compensate for those differences.
This means that state aid formulas can't just set a flat per-student minimum that's the same for everybody. Instead, the minimum amounts might look like this, where districts with large numbers of needy students have higher foundation levels than those with more wealth. State aid formulas like this help to increase funding for poor districts, which is an important step in ensuring that every child receives a quality education. But restrictions on the local property tax threaten to undermine the goals of the school funding reforms. This is what happened in California.
The California school funding tale is a cautionary tale.
After Prop 13, property tax revenues immediately plummeted, and the state legislature scrambled to make up for the lost funds. Under the new system, funding decisions for education were centralized in the state's capital. While the new state aid formula did increase funding for low-spending, property-poor districts, Prop 13 caused many property-wealthy districts to lose funding over time. This affected not just wealthy students, but many low-income students as well.
When you look at disparities in communities and property base per pupil, you might think, well, all low-income needy students are in places with low property base per pupil, and all high-income, well-off students are in places with the high property base per pupil. But there's really a mix.
In the decades since Prop 13 and the Serrano case, education spending in California slowed, dipping during recessions and gradually falling behind the national average.
California achieved greater equity in funding per pupil, not by raising overall spending, but by leveling down.
California's story shows that limiting property taxes, even while increasing state aid, can have the unintended consequence of reducing overall funding for education.
One of the big problems of state funding is that you lose local control. And that means that local citizens don't really have any say in how much money is going to fund their schools. If people don't see the connection between the property taxes they pay and the quality of the schools, there's likely to be less support for public education.
So often I see people say, just let's do state aid instead. And I can just picture in my mind the many graphs that I worked on that show over time state aid going up and coming down during a recession, going up, coming down during a recession, going up, coming down during a recession. So having worked on the data, I just know how frequently in a recession, the state, which has to balance its budget, just looks around and says, how am I going to do this? They cut aid to schools.
Some states were able to learn from California's experience. Residents in Massachusetts, for example, also sued the state for educational inequalities. And later, Massachusetts passed its own property tax limitation called Prop 2.5. But Prop 2.5 was much less severe than California's Prop 13. The new system was different from California's in two important ways. The minimum funding amount took into account the different costs of educating different kinds of students, and communities were allowed to hold a vote to tax themselves more if they wanted to spend more than the minimum on schools. In the years since, Massachusetts school spending has increased compared to the rest of the country. State aid provides crucial funding for the districts that need it most, and local property taxes fund the majority of property-wealthy districts while softening the impact of recessions. Each state has approached its reforms differently, resulting in a remarkably varied picture of school funding across the country. In spite of these reforms, and sometimes because of them, many students remain in underfunded districts, and the debates about property taxes, local disparities, and school funding rage on.
There is no ideal or correct mix of property tax and state aid. In the end, it's all in the details. How do we design our state aid system? How is state aid allocated among the local school districts? How do we operate effectively a property tax system?
Some people think we could get rid of the property tax. Other people don't appreciate the benefits of state aid. Neither the property tax nor state aid are perfect for funding K-12 schools. Both have some advantages, both have problems. So if you're trying to choose between them, you have a dilemma. We need them both. And we need to have both be well designed. And that is the bedrock of a quality education system in the United States.